Hello students and welcome to this week's Community Archives discussion, Documenting Communities. So here are our weekly topics for this week. What strategies can be used to document a community? What resources are required to carry out these strategies? And how do these strategies support the goals of community archives, or more generally, the communities that community archives seek to represent? Okay, so the first one that we will look at is mapping, which is something that the Graham and Noriega article discusses. So all three of our articles for this week are coming from the viewpoint of a more mainstream repository attempting to document a community. So the archives in this week's readings aren't really community archives that are seeking to document the communities that they are a part of. At least ideally they're a part of the community that they're seeking to archive. However, I feel like community archives can engage in these strategies just as well as mainstream archives, or perhaps not just as well, because they may not have as many resources to engage in these activities as mainstream archives may have. But at least theoretically, they're capable of engaging in these activities, and in some ways, if a community archive engages in these strategies or activities to document a community, that's going to result in a product that is more reflective of the reasons why community archives are created and may lead to a situation or a result that is going to be more focused on valuing and protecting and representing the community that is being documented. So with that little caveat out of the way, we'll talk about mapping, which is something that the Grimm and Noriega article discusses. So this is essentially the idea of engaging in research that leads to a mapping of key people, movements, and organizations within a community. So this is a strategy that an archive of any stripe is going to want to do pretty early on in the process of an attempt to document a community, simply because it's going to provide you with an understanding of which aspects of a community are or may be particularly important, and thus perhaps more likely to contain information that is archival and is a vital part of a community and of a community's identity. So to take one example, if you know what are the key organizations in a community, then that community may have records related to the history of the community and may serve as a tool to support the community's sense of identity and representational belonging to a greater extent than another organization that may just not have served as an important function. So for instance, if you are looking at an organization within a community that provided services to community members in sort of a nonprofit beneficial way, then the records within that organization may really reflect struggles that the community has gone through. It may really provide a sense of the history of a community, especially if it's an organization that's been around for a long time. Compared to other organizations that just may not be as important or influential or have as many close ties to a community. So I don't know, like a McDonald's. Obviously, a McDonald's might have some attachment to the community, but generally speaking, you're probably not going to get a lot of records from a McDonald's that is located within a community that are going to be as valuable or useful as records from, say, something like a nonprofit or other organizations that that are more capable of documenting the community and the community's history. So again, this is just kind of a good first step to really find out what kinds of people are influential within a community, what kind of movements, so getting a sense of how the community has changed over time, how the community has reacted to certain events in its past, and again, what type of organizations are actually located within the community or affiliated with the community in some way. They may contain records that are of high value, and simply because of that high value and the capability that these records have of representing the community and its history ought to be singled out for preservation in an archive. Okay, so next we'll talk about summits. This is something that the Grimm and Noriega article also touches on. So this is essentially a series of meetings, or maybe just one meeting, doesn't necessarily have to be a series of meetings, between community members and archivists. So again, this can be mainstream archivists, it could well be community archivists. And this is something that really can aid in the identification of key figures and events and organizations within a community. So you really can find out from community members that may know these key figures or may have been involved in events related to a community, you know, who they think are the most important people that the archive really should seek out in order to document the community and the experiences of the community. So this is kind of a secondary strategy because, of course, you have to know who you want to invite to these summits. You just can't, I mean, I guess you could invite the entire community, but ideally it's a little more targeted, and you really are, at least initially, focusing on the input of people that you have previously identified as being potential important sources of information, or maybe inviting organizations that you've already identified as being potential sources of important records, and inviting them to the summit where you have a more in-depth communication about the types of records that these organizations and people may have, and really just getting more details about the records, maybe doing some outreach and discussing sort of what your community archive is and what it's seeking to do, and just having a good back and forth about what the community archive is and what the community archive has to offer in order to build up interest in the community archive, which is especially important for people that are key members of the community that the archive is seeking to document. The Grimm article discusses that this is an event that needs to be done respectfully. So they talked about, you know, initially they just kind of offered refreshments that weren't really very appealing, and they were like, hey, you know, that was actually kind of disrespectful. So let's provide good refreshments so people actually feel like, you know, the archive values them, and you know, you don't want to turn people off that you invite to this kind of thing. Or they're just going to be like, wow, you know, that archive didn't really treat me very well. I didn't feel like I was respected or that my input was desired. So, you know, it's not going to make someone likely to support your archive if they don't feel like your archive respects them or treats them very well. Even if you did invite them to the summit, if they get there and they're kind of underwhelmed by their experience, then it's not a good first impression to make at all. So this is something that has to be planned. You know, you have to have a lot of forethought about who you're going to invite, what the structure of the summit is going to be like, so it just doesn't seem like chaos. Because, you know, if the summit goes really well, you can meet a lot of people and organizations that can help you document a community. If it goes poorly, you can meet them, but you may alienate them and really lose their interest and willingness in participating in your archive or helping you document the community that you're interested in documenting. Okay, so the Grimm and Noriega article also talks about collection surveys. So this would be, again, kind of a follow-up thing that you would do with individuals or organizations that you had previously identified as being potentially important sources of records. And so this is a strategy where you would actually work with community members to help them inventory the records that they have, look at the conditions of the records, and also doing some pre-donation intervention. So this is something that the Grimm article talks about on page 103. And the idea here is that not only do you get information about what type of records important people and organizations in your community may have, but also you're making sure that these records survive into the future and they remain accessible for as long as possible. So this way, if someone isn't necessarily interested in donating their materials right away, but something that might happen in the future, when it does happen eventually, you want those records to come in a good condition. You don't want them to be, all moldy and or just otherwise inaccessible, maybe on formats that are no longer easily accessible. So this really is something that is focused on pre-donation interventions and making sure that the records survive until they are able to come into the archive, and that when they do come into the archive, they're still in pretty good shape. So the Grimm article talks about how it really is important to educate community members about preservation, probably especially true with digital preservation, which if you've taken a digital preservation course before or talked about it, you'll understand electronic records can be very fragile, and they kind of are easily decayed over time, and there may be some format issues. So they're not records that you can really let sit around for decades and decades and have them arrive at the archive in a condition that is easy for them to be preserved and made accessible. And the Grimm and Noriega article also talks about how these collection surveys can be a great form of outreach. So you're sort of going out, you're educating members of your community or of the community you're trying to document about the importance of the records, about the services that your archive can provide. You're sort of meeting people face to face. You may be going into their homes to discuss different record keeping issues with them. So again, if it's something that goes well, it can be a really positive experience for the potential donor, and really make them aware of your community archive or your archive or your efforts to document their community. And it can be something that really gets people interested in the archive and wanting to be a part of it into the future. Of course, as with every outreach tool, if it goes badly, then the opposite can happen and you can kind of turn people off. So again, this is something that needs to be done very respectfully, and it needs to be something that's done in a structured and organized way, and not just chaos. You can't go in and be all pushy and be like, you're doing this wrong and wrong and wrong. You really need to understand that people may not really know much about archives or about archiving, and you may have to kind of communicate to them different aspects of archives that they may not be aware of in a respectful and polite manner. Another tool that archivists of all stripes, the mainstream or community, can use to document a community is to collect that community's materials. And that's sort of the end goal of the Grimm and Noriega article, is that the records do eventually end up in the repository. Although they aren't really too pushy about that, they say in the article, hey, even if things don't end up in archive, our archive will still recommend a good archive that the records can go to. But yeah, obviously, anytime you collect records from a community, it gives you an opportunity to learn more about that community and about that community's past and history. And that can be a good way to document communities and to provide access to the materials that you are collecting. Okay, so another one that we'll touch on is instruction. And this is something that the Hughes-Watkins article talks about how instruction really can provide a chance for community members and non-community members to interact with records related to underdocumented communities, and how instruction can support multiculturalism by utilizing counter-narratives to white hegemony. So anytime that you can sit in front of the general public, whether they are members of your community or the community that you're trying to document, and provide access and information to them about records, that's a positive thing. It really does provide you with an opportunity to, as the article mentions, make them aware of information that may run counter to some of the narratives about history or about a community that they've read. And it really can be a great outreach tool to make people aware of your collections and of the value of your collections as well. And especially if you're a community archive that is trying to get members of your community interested in supporting your archive, what better way to get them interested than to say, hey, come and learn about how to use an archive, and also show them records that are related to their community's past, and really kind of engage them and get them interested in your repository in that way. And this is something that the Hughes-Watkins article talks about, how they can and even should be oriented towards members of the community represented in the records being used. And the example that the article gives is working with the Black United students at Kent and really giving them instruction sessions using records that are related to the history of their organization, and really getting them interested in wanting to use the archive and support the archive. So if someone isn't aware that their community's records might be held in an archive, then they're probably not going to be interested. They're probably not going to support your archive, and so instruction is just a great way to get that knowledge out and engage the people whose records your archive may be holding. Okay, so another possible way to document a community is through collection assessment. And as the Hughes-Watkins article mentions, this can really help mainstream and community archivists become aware of shortcomings in their collections and reach out to communities or members of communities that have been neglected and say, hey, our archive exists. We're really interested in your past, in your history, and we would like to collect your records to address this shortcoming that we see in our archives and in history in general. So again, this can look slightly different from a mainstream archive perspective versus from a community archives perspective. So if this results in mainstream archives saying, holy crap, we don't have any records related to African Americans in this city, we'd better, run out and get some, then maybe that's less ideal than a community archive saying, well, we have this part of our community represented in our community archive, but we don't really have this part of our community represented, and we would like to make sure that happens so that their voice can be represented in our archives and not lost to history. So this type of strategy shouldn't be used to just kind of fill gaps in a collection, to be used as a way to kind of diversify the archive without really keeping the records in a local context, which is something that Jillian talks about in the framework for community-centric archives that you're probably fairly familiar with by now. Hopefully you are. Okay, so the last strategy that we'll talk about is one that I'm particularly interested in, since I do teach our outreach course, and we talk about exhibits in our outreach course, exhibits. And this is something that the Hughes-Watkins article also touches on, describing how exhibits can be a space for relationship building between the donor and archive. And again, another way to reclaim space in history for marginalized community members. So, what better way to really document a community than to share with the public different examples of the history of the community, and just make them aware of the complexities of the community, the history of the community, the ways that the community is tied into a city or another area that the general public may not be as familiar with. One interesting thing that the Hughes-Watkins article mentions is that as digitization or as exhibits may involve digitization, this really opens the possibility for additional collaboration, or just collaboration in general, with community members. So the example that the article gives is metadata creation. So you digitize records, and then instead of saying, here's the metadata that we're going to use based on, whatever standards or whatever understanding we have of these records, why not work with members of the community that this exhibit is related to, and use the terms that they would use to describe themselves or to describe the records that are included in this exhibit. So this can be a great way to address or to develop participation within your archives by community members, which is something that we talked about for a couple of weeks earlier on in this course. So, and I'm sure that you could collaborate with community members for the text of the exhibit as well, the actual interpretation and narration that you do in every single exhibit. So you can see all of these exhibit materials are supported by sort of interpretive text, and so why not have community members contribute to and have a say in what this text looks like as well, in addition to the metadata. So the Hughes-Watkins article provides another example of community participation or participatory archives when they talk about how using African American alums from Kent and really getting them involved in placing digital and physical records and spaces into their proper context. So again, rather than relying on archives who may not be from the community that the exhibit is about, and saying, we'd really like to have you contribute to how these records are viewed and what context people viewing the exhibit draw from the exhibit itself. And the article talks about how this participatory action by these African American alums or by community members in general can really give participants a sense of ownership and belonging, which again can be a really great way to engage them in in the archive and get them interested in the archive and wanting to be a part of what the archive is involved with. So I will note that in the Rodriguez article that we looked at this week related to documenting Portuguese communities in South Africa, the author does provide a more generalized strategy or model for documenting communities, and that's really interesting to look at as well. So it really all starts with buy-in by the Portuguese community and working with the Portuguese community to really steer the focus of the community archive and to contribute to really all the different archive activities that the archive goes through in order to document this particular community. So if you dig down to stage 4 here, and this is a model that you're going to be looking at for your discussion post for this week as a FYI, you can see that there are some strategies here that can be used to document a community as well, or steps that are a part of the process of documenting a community. I won't focus on these as much because they're not described in as much detail as the ones that I talked about earlier, but they are important parts of the overall puzzle of documenting a community. So seeking financial support, obviously sustainability is a big part of documenting a community, having a strategy for that, formulating a collection policy, that's a big part of how you document a community, and maybe that can be related to having these summits and collection surveys. So there is some overlap between this model and some of the stuff mentioned in the Grimm and Noriega and Hughes-Watkins articles. Obviously, infrastructure and developing that is an important consideration. So, these are all parts of the process, and it is a lot, and it does take a lot of resources to make this happen, which is something that we'll touch on earlier. So this is a big one right here, and it's one that I've mentioned a few times: ongoing promotional and outreach activities. And it really is important to think about how a lot of these other things can be ongoing promotional and outreach activities. So if you're determining records practices of organizations in your community, that's a great opportunity for them to learn more about your archive and what your archive does and why your archive is valuable, and you can go from there. When you're formulating a collection policy, if you're working with community members that you've identified as being particularly important or influential within the community, which is kind of a precursor to this step, then that can be a great outreach and promotional opportunity as well. Records audits, same thing. Seeking financial support. In order to do that, you're going to have to engage in promotional and outreach activities. Compiling an archival project proposal. Again, that's something that you can involve, or you really need to involve members of the community that you're trying to involve with your archive. So, outreach and promotion is extremely important for every archive, as I discussed a lot in my outreach class, but especially community archives, if you are going to get involved in this kind of process, which as we'll talk about later on, can really involve a lot of different resources, which may be more difficult for archives that are underfunded to have access to. Okay, so here's our first key excerpt for the week. So this is from the Hughes-Watkins article. I didn't put on here which key excerpt this is. I think it's 11.5 or 11.6, but anyway, I'm going to say it's 11.5. I think that's what it is, but it's on pages 12 and 13, so yeah. Anyway, so it talks about, again, this idea of including people that were involved or related to some photos that the archive at Kent University had, and getting them involved with the records and interacting with the records. So, this can, again, be a great strategy for documenting a community. You really are working with people who have some connection with the events involved in records that you're trying to learn more about, and through this this interaction and this participation by community members, learn more about the different activities that might be represented in a collection, whether it be in correspondence or other materials, or in this case, a collection of photographs. So you're taking photographs that don't really have descriptions, and you're saying, okay, well, the best way to find out what's going on in these photos is to actually locate people that have some connection with these records, and using their expertise and their involvement with these records to actually document what's going on in these photos. So again, a great way to learn more about the photos and to really have hopefully really good information about what the photos contain, and also a fantastic way for archives, for community archives to sustain themselves. So again, if you engage in this kind of participatory process, then you can get people interested in your archives and valuing your archives and wanting to contribute and participate in the success of your archives, even just beyond this this particular activity. So if you tell someone, hey, I value your perspective, we could really use your help to get a better idea about what's going on in these photos, that really is going to lead to them having a positive impression of your archive, more of an understanding of what your archive is trying to accomplish, and at least ideally, that interest and awareness of your archive is going to translate into some kind of continued support into the future, whether it's, again, maybe helping describe materials or contributions in another form. So why is sustainability and support important for all archives, especially community archives? Because these strategies that we have discussed in this lecture certainly are not free. And even just beyond financial contributions, there are a lot of other resources that that archives of all stripes really need to document communities in an effective and professional or useful way. So on page 145 in the Rodriguez article, the author lists some things that are important for community archives just to get off the ground. So he mentions good governance, sustained funding, external support, skilled staff, collaboration with formal archives. I don't know that that's necessarily a requirement. Dynamism and commitment on part of the staff, which is something that we'll touch on later. Appropriate preservation, sound archival practices in areas such as appraisal, arrangement, description, finding aids, access and promotion, and community engagement. So that's just to get things started. It's like, okay, I'd like a pony too, right? So all these different aspects of really getting a community archival project off the ground take resources. So good governance, that takes time and expertise for people to carry out. Sustained funding, that takes outreach. That takes a lot of. If you're looking at grant writing, it can take a lot of time to write grants. skilled staff. It can take a lot of expertise really to do all the things that this section mentions. Appropriate preservation, all this stuff requires money and expertise and all kinds of archival infrastructure. And community archives may find that to be in shorter supply than more mainstream archives and other information institutions in general. Again, I don't really know that collaboration with the formal archives sector to achieve expertise is necessarily true. I think as we've argued, or at least I've argued, I don't know if you agree with me or not, but in some ways, archival expertise from mainstream archives can get in the way of a community archive really being reflective of its community and how its community communicates and how records are viewed within the community. So, maybe you can strike that one out, but in some instances, that does help you achieve some of these other goals, such as skilled staff. As we discussed last week, mainstream archives may provide advice or training to community archivists in some of the areas that the Rodriguez article mentioned, such as appraisal, arrangement, description, and so on. One other important resource or type of infrastructure that is really helpful for documenting a community is imagination and flexibility. So the Rodriguez article touches on this on page 147, where the author talks about how as he was developing this model and looking at Portuguese community organizations, it became evident that often one archiving approach for their records was not agreed on by all community-based organizations and members, and consensus was not reached. So a lot of the areas of tension and debate that we talked about in this class before can kind of rear their heads, and different organizations and different community members may have different ideas about how they want their records to be preserved. And so in order to address those and in order to end up having access to these records, which can support the documentation of a community, you do need to be flexible. You need to be patient, whether you're a community archivist or a mainstream archivist that's trying to address the different ideas about record keeping that different organizations and people might have. And it can be pretty difficult to herd cats and to get people to agree on the best way to approach the preservation of records, which may be extremely important to them, and they may not want to give control over to even a community archivist. So I think it's a good thing to mention here, and it certainly is something that can cause a lot of disagreements in communities about how records are handled and who gets to make those decisions, and it's likely not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. So yeah, I think a big thing is energy and commitment. So that's something that the Rodriguez article touched on, dynamism and commitment on the part of staff. So that really reflects this idea of being flexible, and also the idea that it can be a difficult thing to get a community archive off the ground or to document a community, and you just need to be committed, and you need to really have a lot of energy and just focus and desire to document the community that you're trying to document, because it's not going to be easy. You're going to have a lot of things stacked against you, especially as a community archivist, but as a mainstream archivist as well. And you just need to have the perseverance to push through them and achieve your goals as a community archive or as a mainstream archive as well. So it's interesting to think about how some of these strategies support the goals of community archives. I've alluded to some of them before. So we've talked about community participation, which we've discussed as being generally positive for communities and reflective of the goals of community archives. The Grimm article talks about how these strategies can lead to the stabilization of materials, both inside and outside of the archive, which can result in records arriving to community archives or mainstream archives in a better state. We talked, or on page 104 in the Grimm article, the authors discuss how one result of documenting community history can be the creation of publications that document the community. So something that can result from surveys and the collection of material. And again, this might be a little problematic if it seems like a situation where mainstream archives are publishing articles or books or whatever that is really their perspective on a community as opposed to the community's perspective on itself. So if there isn't a lot of collaboration here, then this really isn't something that does support the goals of community archives. But if it is a process that community members are involved with, then that's kind of a different story. If these publications really are the result of a collaborative process between whoever is writing the book and community members, and community members are allowed to determine what shape the narrative that publications contain, then that's a different story. On page 105, the Grimm and Noriega article talks about how these documentation strategies can really lead to the development of interpersonal relationships that can lead to the rescue of records in peril. So they give an example in their article about how a landlord is basically like, you have 48 hours to come and get these records. And so as a result of the relationships that that archivist had with community members, and as a result of the survey information that they had, they were really able to swoop in and protect those records. And obviously that's something that community archivists I think are going to be in support of as well. No one wants to see records destroyed, and if these documentation strategies do end up resulting in mainstream and community archivists being in a position that allows them to prevent this from happening as much as possible, then that is beneficial. So it's hard to see how that would be against the goals of community archives. Overall, a lot of this is related to sustainability, to making connections with members of the community and building bridges to them and getting them involved and interested in documenting the community. Again, whether this documentation takes place within a mainstream archive or a community archive, at the end of the day, it is getting community members involved with the archive and interested in the archive, and engaged with the archive, and hopefully contributing to the sustainability of the archive and the continued access of this information. So all of these different strategies that we've looked at really can foster community participation, which I would argue is essential to the success of most any archive, but especially community archives. So again, if you sort of view all these different strategies, the ones that we talked about specifically and the ones that the Rodriguez article discusses on through the lens of outreach and as opportunities to interact with and reach out to community members, that's something that can really help the sustainability of your community archive and allow your community archive to stay open and do all the things that community archives really are meant to do, which we've touched on earlier in this class. So I won't reiterate them, but Yeah, obviously, or at least I feel the more community archives are involved with carrying out these strategies, the more reflective of the values and goals of community members the archive is going to be. So if it's a mainstream archive that is documenting these materials or documenting these communities, then the result may not be as community-centric as if it is a community archive that is engaging in this process, simply because, at least ideally, community archives involve more participation with community members and provide community members with more power to determine what the results of this documentation looks like, and in turn, how the community is represented in archives and in history. So, especially the Grimm and Noriega and the Hughes Watkins article really seemed focus on the idea of community participation. And I'm certainly not going to say that it's impossible for mainstream archives to engage in these types of documentary strategies in a way that does support the goals and needs of community members who may have been marginalized in the past. But, you know, I guess I feel like the results of this documentation is going to be more aligned with the goals and wishes of community members if it is done sort of within the community, simply because that provides more of an opportunity for community participation, and it can provide community archivists with the opportunity to throw off some of the archival traditions and philosophies and thought processes that in a lot of ways have made them not really reflective of the goals of community members in the past, which is why community archives exist today, right? So, yeah. Okay, we'll wrap things up by doing another key excerpt. So this is 11.1 from the Grimm and Noriega article. So this is talking about the importance of really focusing on, as I discussed before, things like watershed events and key figures and mentors, and the importance of really framing the discussion about community members and organizations within a community in a sensitive and respectful way. So not saying this something is important, this something isn't important, but maybe using different language to kind of communicate that. And again, really asking participants to share who they feel should be represented, and using that as a guiding post for collections that are they're sort of earmarked for follow-up surveys and other activities. And also the importance of finding, you know, highly respected or senior members of the community. So in this example, veteranos or senior artists and arts organizers. So again, just identifying who within a community has influence, who within a community might be particularly involved with watershed events, or who has served as key figures or mentors within the community, and then using that as a starting point for all the other strategies that we've talked about. Of course, this may not be easy. Different people within your community may have different perspectives on who are sort of the key or influential figures or events within the community, and that's certainly a challenge that community archives can face. If you are really trying to focus on particular aspects of a community or of a community's history, then that certainly leaves open the possibility that you can get it wrong, and the people that you sort of focus on aren't really as important as they think they are, or maybe other people think they are, or certain events weren't as important to the community. Or you just might upset people because no matter how you cage it, if someone hears that you're approaching, someone else for their collections and not approaching someone else, then that can lead to a lot of debate within the community about sort of what are the important aspects of that community's past, and your community archive may not be seen as a really valid or representative institution within the community, which can cause you a whole host of other issues in the future. So again, this is something that has to be done very carefully and very respectfully, and with a lot of planning and a lot of input from as many community members as possible, so that hopefully you do get it right and that you don't offend people that may have different perspectives about your community or your community's history. And it's not to say that you can only do this once. Maybe you can do a follow-up summit or some additional mapping once you learn more about the community and about the community's history, and maybe talk with some additional people and sort of circle back and go through some of these documentation strategies a second or third, or who knows how many times before you really feel comfortable that the information that you have is correct. Okay, so that's it for this week. Hopefully you've seen a lot of echoes or reflections of things that we've talked about in the past in these chapters. So we've touched on postmodernism, community participation, and a few other aspects of the course as well, tension and debate between community members. So next week we'll look at some different examples of discussions over whether or not certain material should be included in a community archive or in an archive in general, and put that discussion through the topic of community power and the desire to represent a community as completely and truthfully as possible, and also some of the sustainability issues that may result from including certain materials in archival collections. So just a little bit of a preview for next week. Enjoy the rest of this week. And I look forward to seeing your final projects, and please remember to do the discussion post for this week. Okay.